Nothing we say here is investment advice, legal advice, life advice, or representative of the views of the organization we are part of or affiliated with. See chainabstracted.com for more information. Hey everyone, Altan. Hey, nice to jump on, man. Dude, the first podcast post the big Nuffle launch. This is cool. So if you could just give a little bit of your backstory of those, maybe not the whole full 25 years unless you want, but where
Yeah.
you did and where you are now type stuff.
Yeah. I'll run it by real quick. But yeah, I have a degree in computer engineering from Purdue. I spent a bunch of time in big tech, Microsoft. I was I've been a developer and engineer, for as long as I can remember. I started coding when I was really young. I was running code in this language called Basic back when I was 8. This is in the 80s. But yeah, spent a lot of time doing developer platforms at Microsoft. I've been in Silicon Valley since 2001, so I moved here right after college. And I saw sort of the birth and growth of everything Silicon Valley through the 90s and the 2000s. And, very much, again, I think I was like forward manifesting all of this. I wanted to be a founder. So for the first 10 years, I was in big tech. For the next decade of my professional career, I was a startup founder. I was a CEO founder. And without boring you folks with all the details, it was kind of through an accident that I met a bunch of folks who were mining Bitcoin back in 2012. And that's kind of how I got into the world of Bitcoin and crypto. It felt like this, I guess the analog that I like to use is that I'm an immigrant, and like a lot of people like to find solace in their communities that they feel comfortable or close to. And crypto felt like this very burgeoning early community of just like rogue tech enthusiasts. And I was like, okay, this feels like a crowd that I can be a part of. But yeah, stayed close to the ecosystem. Again, my company we went through our roller coaster of ups and downs and fundraising and growth and eventual acquisition. And I decided I want to do this full time. And so here we are now. I run an early stage fund called Canonical, where, yeah, we focus on early stage investments in great companies. Like Alton's a great founder and a great example. And yeah, lately I've been focusing a lot on sort of the intersection of AI and crypto.
Yeah, it's a great story. I mean, getting that handle now, it should have been if you were to try to get that handle now, there would have been a lot of bidding on that one. So I love to basically break this down. I mean, we can start with a bit more broad and get a bit more in detail. So like now you're sitting in the market and say, hey, I'm basically very interested in the intersection of crypto and AI. What does chain abstraction mean in that world? Like, is there something that, do you see an intersection of crypto AI and chain abstraction? And yeah, we can just start deeping down from there.
Yeah, I was thinking analogs, right? So, and one sort of constant has been that the learning for me has been that history doesn't always repeat, but it rhymes. And so, like, I use that as sort of the backdrop, and I think about like, what does chain abstraction mean to us? And this feels like a topic that's come up a lot lately, but it's almost necessary, right? Because if you look at the progression of blockchains, I don't appreciate the choir here. You folks are the experts, but as an outsider, I like to look at why this is essential today and what's brought us here. But for me, like the biggest sort of unlock back in the day was something like Kubernetes. Again, I'm dating myself a little bit, but Kubernetes, which served as sort of an abstraction layer between various cloud platforms and hosted applications, right? It helped you deploy and manage and scale across various different cloud environments. And so this is sort of analogous to that. Now you look at either developers or you think about users and you think about the necessity for abstraction because maybe you want to take advantage of capabilities on one chain versus using accounts on another chain. And this is where abstraction becomes paramount. So just set the backdrop now, Alton, maybe to answer your question more succinctly. I think when it comes to AI, there may be a few different touch points, right? So there's the developer POV, which is one demographic. There's the user demographic, which is the other. From a developer standpoint, I think Alton, you touched on this a little bit, which is, will a developer need to learn the minutia of a specific chain's programming paradigms? WASM versus Rust or something else, and what can chain abstraction do to sort of ease that? Or can you use tooling that's LLM powered to be able to deploy smart contracts more efficiently? So that's like one way to think about it. The other is sort of user interactions, right? And this can sort of transcend into agentic interactions as well, right? Like, I think the velocity with which users have started using blockchains, which is now morphed into, I mean, obviously there's like some amount of botting farming that happens that we all are aware of. And then now we go sort of to an exponential level of like usage, which is, I say we lean into this, right? Like, I don't think we should run away from this botting. I think it is inherently what blockchains have to offer. And I think this is where agentic platforms come into play, right? Like, they will need to interact and they will need to do things on behalf of users primarily, and then eventually maybe for themselves to take advantage of what different chains have to offer. So that's where I think chain abstraction becomes even more paramount. I think we are kind of graduating from, interoperability as sort of like one Lego block to abstraction as at another, so that whoever the end users, developers, users, agents can leverage various capabilities, various chains very, very easily and succinctly. So, and I think to me, there's, just to wind this back and put a bow on it, I'd say there's two ways to think about it. The first is, who are the users? Are they agents? Are they sort of, AI bots that need to be able to use these platforms? And the other is, how do we make this tooling more easy and usable and customizable? And I think that's another sort of demographic to tap into.
I think great response, but I'm picking up on this AI agents. You're actually using the AI agent as a user too. And I think that's like, this is where it starts getting really interesting, right? So will it maybe be so blockchain is a good way of proof of source, like proof of truth, let's call it, like a moment that is like immutable on a blockchain. Then you have AI, which is almost like infinite creation. Mm-hmm. And I think, do you think they need to work together in order to sort of like rein each other in a way?
Yes and no, right? Like, I think that reining, again, that's got like such a strong connotation when it comes to how we think about the ethos of blockchains. And so I think there are guardrails, there are sort of modes of operation that make sense, but at the same time, and I think this is up to us to define, but let me maybe even take a step back, right? Which is, knowing how these are constructed and how these agents are constructed, how they're operating, and the fact that we want to be able to audit and verify them is like maybe most paramount. And today, like, we have very little transparency into closed source systems and how they operate. So like, let's just set that precedent that we want to operate in a more open, transparent, verifiable, auditable way. Like, that should be sort of like the basics and building blocks on top of which we build anything. And then the second is guardrails, right? Like, what are the parameters under which these need to operate? So that's like the reining in to some extent. So I don't think we want to rein in the innovation part of it. I think we want to rein in the operational auditability part of it, right? So I think that's what you're trying to say, Jared. So yeah, I think they go hand in hand for sure. I think I can imagine a world in which today there's a lot of things. I mean, this is the beauty of like machines and the progression of like dating back to like I've been, I don't want to go off on this tangent here necessarily per se, but I've been really digging into the sort of the philosophy and growth of intelligence over time. And, because we've been talking about, machine-oriented intelligence, like the need for replacing limbs with prosthetics and things like that for forever, like before these even became, before medical advances even started to happen, right? So we've been thinking about like this concept of robotics and things like that for a very long time, and philosophizing, theorizing on it for a long time. But these have all been to aid human capabilities, right? So that's one where we see, and again, we've been theorizing about this maybe for a more brief period of time, maybe in the last 3 to 4 years, maybe even Ilya has been talking about it, which is, there's a world in which agents think and operate somewhat autonomously, and how do we give them the rails to operate and behave there? And that becomes fascinating to think about. But that's where maybe, again, you build with the ethos of transparency, openness, verifiability, and then you give them guardrails. That becomes a good way to get started.
Yeah, I just think like in the future, it's going to be me with my team of AI agents, right? Like I do a lot of content, so I'm going to have like my content agent team, right? And they're going to actually get to know me better than myself. Like I'm going to be talking, like I'm already every morning talking to AI and be like, hey, help me kind of like organize my day and stuff. Like that's just going to increase. So then a question is it important to have like, Near's doing a lot of user-owned AI versus maybe corporate-owned AI. Do you think a lot about in that space? Like, I kind of think like if these things are going to get to know me really well, I kind of hope it's user-owned AI and not something else. But I don't know. I guess from a professional like you, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is the beauty of like machines and the progression of like dating back to like ancient, I mean, I've been, I think Absolutely. It feels inevitable in some ways, right? So like, I mean, just to tease this a little bit more, it's funny how some of these things sound so science fictiony, but just like you said, like you start your day and everything was starting to realize the potential of AI to an extent that we had only theorized about for a long time, right? Like this is, Neil Stephenson's The Diamond Age, where they talk about these, there's this character and she grows up with an AI, right? Like it's sort of like the companion that that Nell's been tethered to. So, but this is going to become natural, and that is, you know, that's great. That's our steady state experience. Like we want this to happen. Like, agents that help you perform various functions, agents that maybe can like, classic case in point, I had someone message me on Telegram last night, and I was like, I would love to, what's the right answer there, right? Like how, of course, I don't want it to be immediate, but at the same time, I want an action on it if it's going to change my day for some reason. So how do
Hmm.
these things act when we're not able to? Because that's what machines have been, designed to do to help augment human behavior to a large extent. But also then, how much responsibility do we hand over so that they can start really working for us? So these are some of the things. Yes, user-owned
Yeah.
AI is inevitably where things are going
Mm.
because you want to have agency, no pun intended, over how these things operate because they are going to mimic you. Your concept of a digital twin, for example, like things like that, getting more and more popular today. But to be able to do that, yeah, they do need to understand who you are, and
Yeah.
they need to operate in a privacy-centric fashion as well, which is paramount. And again, all these sound exactly like what we've been preaching in the world of blockchains
Hmm.
for over a decade now. So I feel like these two technologies are on a collision course.
Yeah. I have a question there. So I guess like imagine a world where everything is done by agents, right? I mean that
Hmm.
as you said, they have their own agency, they do things. Um and we talk about this a lot in the space that I'm probably at this point an expert in, which is roll-ups, right? How does the security come from? If you're doing something, how do we translate that security to do something on an off chain and prove that on chain?
Hmm.
How do you think about that for agents? Like, is this a world where we drive security from crypto economic values, or we do this in a more of a zero knowledge fashion where we do this cryptographically?
That's a good question. Maybe there's some, I think in these sorts of situations, use cases are like, ways to decide like what the flow chart's going to look like in some ways. Um, the reality is that there are a lot of situations for which we can see agents operating autonomously using crypto economics because that's just going to come more naturally. Like it's just more native. The need, I think we know this, right? Like anytime you feel like you need to use something that has to go off chain or use extraneous environments to operate on chain, that just adds a level of complexity that, I mean, we've solved this using oracles, we've solved this using, provers and off chain compute. Like we're getting better at this. Um, but it adds some extra complexity. So I think crypto economics seem more natively the way to get started, but there may be use cases for which, like, we may have to think about off-chain processes as well. And maybe I'll just throw in another sort of wrench into this equation, right? Which is there may be situations where agents again have to operate. Um, and again, there's the user-in agents, there's the operational modality of these, right? And those need to be codified and
Mm-hmm.
verified. And I think that's where blockchains come in. Um, and then they need to transact. How are they going to transact with one another, right? Like, what does that look like? And I think the question that's been asked many, many times now is, yeah, even think of these agents as like humans are on Earth. Um, what do their bank accounts look like, right? So, and they don't know what a bank is, right? So that this is like wallets and like crypto is going to be first nature to them, um, and there may be situations where like this is where the wrench comes in, right? Like these agents will need to operate without enough information, and therefore will need to lean on humans to supplement the information they don't have, right? So this is where off-chain compute becomes even more real. So like I think
Mm-hmm.
Ilya said this very succinctly. I remember it was September 2023 at a side event we hosted where he was like, "We're going to be working for AI in the foreseeable future." I think he projected this year, by the way. I don't think I can hold him to that, but I think it'll start to happen, right? Like agents are going to put out bounties, to say humans like go get this information for me because I don't have it, and then they're going to have to pay us so because they don't have enough information to work with. So it's going to be pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa. I just like I really like talking about AI and crypto because then we get into this level of conversation where it's like an AI might eventually reach out to us and then it's going to be like it's wild.
It's pretty nutty to think about, and it feels like again it feels very science fiction. It's
It
like
does.
it feels dystopian to some extent, but the
Mm-hmm.
rate of progress of technology is unlike anything that I've ever seen, and I won't spend too much time. I don't want to sound like the old person in the room, but I think I was talking alt on this. There's this programming language called Lisp, Lisp programming, which is it's been sort of like the cornerstone of everything AI for many decades. I think it was invented in the 80s, but I took a programming class on Lisp in 1999, and that was like it was like marketed as like the AI course, right? This is 1999, by the way. And like, okay, AI is imminent. It's going to happen. Robots are going to take over the world. We're going to live in like a Jetsons future where there's going to be flying cars. And like, that's the world. This was 1999. And so like, because the internet had just started up and this is where we thought things were headed as quickly as then, what we realized was missing was, obviously like the growth and progress of AI, there was a pre-Transformers era, there's a post-Transformers era, but data was really missing. Data needed to exist to the point where these models need to get trained adequately to get to this point. I bring all this up because it is really fascinating to theorize, and it's always felt like science fiction, and it's always felt like it's eons away. But
Mm.
now more than ever, it feels like it's right around the corner. Like we could be talking about this, and it's going to be very real, very quickly. So yeah, I'm super excited. I think it's scary to a lot. It's exciting to me as a pure technologist, and maybe also maybe very naive operational modality. But yeah, it feels like we're going to be hyper productive and working on things that we really naturally care about because everything else is going to be going to be done for us hopefully by these clever user-owned models and agents.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing is like, okay, so we have obviously we have all these like centralized companies. If you look at data collection,
Yeah.
and curation, it's mainly done by Scale,
Hmm.
Scale.ai, I think is the
Hmm.
company,
Yeah.
and then models are trained by pretty much OpenAI, Google, and all of them. They're very centralized. If you look at this pipeline, I mean, GPUs are owned by one company, pretty much. That's NVIDIA. How do you win against this
Mm.
much capital and this much sort of power, right? Again, and how do you decentralize that? I think that's kind of
Yeah.
what can someone do? I mean, Ilya is a good example of
Yeah.
someone who's trying to do that from our community, who understands
Yeah.
obviously both.
Yes.
But how can we win that, and what can someone do?
Yeah, it's I think this is the question, right? And I feel like we need to spend a lot of time thinking about this. So the way I would position it is like again, we've learned a ton from the last couple of decades of living and growing up on the internet, right? So
Hmm.
there are like I mean, Google, for example, is a great, is like one cornerstone of like, if I need to access information on the internet, like you don't think about anything else. You think about Google, right? Like I need to go Google it, right? That's it. Um, and of course, that's been the incumbent model. But Google is an interesting business model, right? Like although you would search something on there, it would redirect you to a page or content that would get you that information. This level of intelligence we're seeing right now is trying to make it such that like you can access this information right without having to leave that particular experience, right?
Hmm.
ChatGPT, and I don't know if you saw last week. It's the week of the 17th of June, 2024, right now. But I think it was sometime last week when a few different reporters started to call out Perplexity because Perplexity
Hmm.
was creating summaries of news articles,
Hmm.
wordsmithing what was being written on other articles. They're like, wait a second.
Hmm.
So this is interesting. This is not just like backdating information. This isn't just Wikipedia-esque, but this is real-time information, right? So there's examples of Perplexity or Grok or like, which is Twitter or X's platform where, they can give you, it's kind of like, you know, RAG happening on top of existing data modalities, which is really fascinating. So
Yeah.
yeah, I would say that it is, yes, power is aggregating to the centralized entities, but I'm trying to break down the problems that exist, which is, A, we're moving into a centralized world. There's no transparency here. Again, there's many group chats that we're all probably a part of where there's questions that are arising about the level of privacy associated with these centralized
Mm-hmm.
services, right? So I saw this Reddit post the other day, which was there was a user who had plugged in his Nest camera into his house, in his apartment, and he was collecting these video snippets, running them by GPT. I think it was GPT-4, and it was saying, "Hey, by the way, like, where are my keys, or where did I leave this thing that I in my house, right?" So, and that was happening almost in real time. And
It's
I was like,
nice.
this is cool,
I
but at the
like
same
it.
time, yeah, but it's wacky to think about because A, there's like you're using again a centralized server for like what's happening inside your house. Um, you're one hack away, by the way, from like your data getting leaked, which happens. I mean, like what do we hear about the DocuSign leak? Which was like
Yeah,
doc.
yeah.
I think I apologize if I've got that mistaken, but some of these companies have one job, right? Which is like you want to maintain your users' information without it getting leaked, and like when that happens, all hell breaks loose. So imagine a world in which again you can tap into like hackers are breaking into video cameras that's placed inside the house, and that has happened by the way. This is fact. Then you combine that with running it through a centralized service, and again by default, by the way, privacy is not turned on, right? So like you might opt in to providing some information back to fine tuning those models without you even knowing you're doing this. So these are all sort of existing problems that exist. So let's come back to like swinging the pendulum from centralized services to user owned, or like a collaborative that helps you manage
Mm-hmm.
these models and operationing functions. And yeah, let me put it this way, right? And so I'm answering the question for you. Do you want to see a world like 20, 30 years from now where you grew up with this? Jared, you said it well, right? Like I have agents working for me, or like I want to have these bunch of things happening for me. How much of this do you want controlled by a large centralized entity that's trying to monetize your
Mm-hmm.
data versus you feel like you have ownership over it, and agency over it? Yet you still get to realize all the technological gains. So
Yeah.
that's the question. Sorry for the long-winded preamble, but I think it just comes down to that: ownership,
Yeah.
data privacy, and agency.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. One question there is like, one thought is, we data privacy existed for a while, right? I mean,
Hmm.
like Google tried to do this federated learning in 2017, where they just said, "Hey, I don't want to
Hmm.
extract
Hmm.
your data. I just actually want to train the data on your device and send it back to a central server where I don't see your data anymore."
Yes,
But again, right, like my grandma or my mom doesn't care about this stuff. So I think,
that is
like,
correct.
do you
Yeah.
see a diversion of, like, because if you read a lot of these sort of think about, I read this book called Homo Deus, where people are going
Yeah.
to be very different, like in terms of
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
people who are thinking about it or not thinking about it. Are we going to diverge as a society to say some people, they won't care about it, people like us who are pretty tech savvy, I would say, right? Like anybody that works in crypto. Is this the future of how this is going to look like? And yeah.
It's a valid point. I would say that users, the average user doesn't care about it. Absolutely,
Yeah.
100%. Like we don't, you know, I mean, forget, I mean, with all due respect to all our elders and everyone, I think there's people in our immediate circles, even the tech circles, who don't care about this today enough.
Yeah.
Um, but I feel like we're going through this wave of technology revolution, renaissance in some way, where it feels
Mm-hmm.
responsible for developers, for us to think about this, because
Mm-hmm.
this is we lead the way here. So I think ultimately it goes back to your question, right, which is like we didn't start to think this way, but do we want to continue building on the same Lego blocks of just like you know, being able to trust centralized entities with power aggregating towards these centralized monopolies that monetize our data for their own good and their own use? Or do we
Mm-hmm.
want a sense of ownership when it comes down to it at the end of the day, right? So classic, I mean, more prescient example is that like we talked about these data DAOs, or like this is becoming a popular concept. There's a company called Vanna, for example, that's like thinking about these data DAOs. But wouldn't it be awesome if like this exact federated training modality that you mentioned, if I felt some level of agency over it, like I would feel comfortable. Like I think Fred Wilson from Union Square Ventures talked about this maybe a year and a half ago. We're like, hey, we have these primitives like wallets, for example, using which you can sign a transaction and or like permit it to do something on my behalf, right? Sign a transaction and something happens on chain. What if we could use this analog to that to be able to hand over my data? And then when that happens, that's the beginning of like some process that needs to happen, right?
Yeah.
So like, again, attribution, or like I contribute my data, or I can encrypt my data, or maybe I can, cleanse it such that it removes any sort of PII, and then it's being used for training. So these sorts of things are, we just need to operate from those levels of first principles. And then, yeah, my ideal steady state, and I promise I'll stop rambling after this, which is, I think, OpenAI, as we all know, is not open. I think we really, really, and any other models out there, I would say same thing with Llama and others. I guess the question always comes up for me is that, like, this is awesome, they're open weights, but where did the data come from? How were these trained? How does someone get compensated for the data they contributed to these ecosystems? Should they be compensated? Did they even opt in? And then where are we at today? And like we should all be proud of using a system that we're exceptionally proud of, right? And that we have transparency and agency into. It doesn't start with the user. The user doesn't care. And I don't think they will for the foreseeable future. Although it's like, I think current cohorts probably care about this stuff a lot more than maybe our older generations do, right? Like I think my daughter and like the generations of today care a lot more about, let's say, climate and things of that nature than maybe we did growing up, because it's impacting them and their future, right? So I think the current generations will. The older generations may not, but let's also lead with that precedent that we just want to see these principles, build on these sorts of principles, and create a better future for ourselves.
Dude, there's so much to unpack there, but I really like. So here's what's awesome. So okay, so maybe privacy data might not be the thing that gets people to do it, but I do think that you said something there like value, and what blockchain is really awesome at is like creating value or like making value appear in a way, or catching value that wasn't possible before in a centralized way. And then I take that we've got this Web 2 internet for the last, literally since MySpace, is just sort of like farming humans' data and making profit. That's sort of like the business model. And it's we just all accepted it. But now we've got sort of this revolution renaissance. I'm kind of just like paraphrasing what you just said, just to make sure I'm kind of on the same way. But like now we can actually create a way that people's data or whatever they want to do, they can have the choice. Hey, keep it encrypted. Don't mess with me, because now I've got my agent team. Maybe I don't want to share that info. Or there's a way to leveraging blockchain, because it's got that wonderful way to transfer value for low fees and lots of hexadecimals and all that, that it can now, you could actually like opt into being part of the AI system and getting actual value for it. And it's possible with Web3 and AI. I'm thinking that's kind of what I'm just coming at. So there's no real question here. I'm just like, my mind is being blown. That's, I think, the question here, because it's pretty wild to think about, because I've just given away my data for 20 years.
Yeah, we all have, right? We've taken it for granted, and it feels like I'm getting more and more conscious of this now than ever before, right? Like I don't use GPT models, and this is just me, N of one here, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think I was saying also on this maybe last time we chatted, which is I'm doing all my inference locally now on my machine, and I have an M2, so it's capable of doing some heavy duty, inference. And I think maybe this stems from a little bit of paranoia, but also, I remember my mentor told me this in the 2000s. It's called like, when you're a developer, you need to have something called healthy paranoia, right? So it's just like I always operate with that. So I feel like it's someone a healthy paranoia, but it's also something that I want to see out there in the world, right? How do we give agency to users to be able to do this more on their own? As a company, these guys called EXO, for example. I know Alton's pretty close to this team, but they're a good example of this, right? Like enabling inference at the edge, right? Or enabling the ability to really like manage and operate with your own data in a more codifiable way. And of course, we heard about, Apple loves to brand everything as Apple, right? So now they're calling it Apple Intelligence, which is, a lot of things will happen on the edge, and they'll default to ChatGPT or GPT or other models, if they can't get it done on the device. But it's just a toggle away from becoming, from being shared with centralized services. So yeah, I react, and I 100% agree and empathize with what you're saying. And yeah, I go back to Alton's question, like, do we need this? Do we need to think about this? And I would say it's a worthwhile endeavor to manifest our way into this, because it'll be worth it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And whereas, like, yes, will incumbents? I think both will exist 100%. I don't think this is a replacement.
Mm-hmm.
This is like the open source argument against closed source Windows. This is the,
Yeah.
this is going to be a very cheesy example we're going to say, but this is like the Android to iOS, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we will have these comps that just need to suit the modern day requirements that are emerging because of intelligence.
Yeah. Well, it's not that cheesy example, but there's a lot of folks that came into the space, I think crypto AI space, just
Hmm.
because AI was just hype and they just wanted to extract value out of it.
Yeah.
How do we, so now that you're looking into from an investor perspective, leaving that aside, like what do you see that's in the short term that's very valuable for crypto AI and in the long term as well that I think leaving the short term maybe it's not really relevant for folks, but it's something that can accrue value and do something, have a dent in the broader AI space, not only in crypto AI.
Yeah. I would say that, maybe just react to your first comment, which is the history of, like, in the brief history of crypto has been that, like, it's rarely winner takes all, it's winner takes most. That's been sort of like the precedent that's been set. We have many layer ones that are great. We have many layer twos that are great. We have a lot of layer threes emerging. We have chain abstraction, which is hopefully going to solve all, of like the user experience issues, which I know is like the fundamental theme of this podcast. Um, and yeah, it was probably not unnatural to think about, you know, many examples of solving the same problem in a differentiated way with token incentivized mechanics. So it started with compute and the need for compute, sort of bare metal access to compute. And Akash, for example, has been doing this longer than most, right? And they are, by and large, I think one of the more reliable systems out there when it comes to sort of access to bare metal compute. It can be run for training, it can be used for inference, whatever you want to use it for. But then, like, you start to move up stack, or you start to use more software centric modes, right? Like very API centric modes, and not like, again, the loose analog is something like, Heroku versus AWS, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you want to be able to deploy something and get up and running quickly. So we're going to have to start to move in that direction. So that's kind of what's happening now. So maybe more succinctly to answer your question, right? I think we're starting to see a lot of the low-hanging fruit get picked off, which is access to compute. And let's just put this out there. Let's get this done very quickly, and there'll be a few winners there, and maybe like a long tail. I don't think there's going to be a torso. It's going to be a head, and there'll be a very very long tail of things that will exist. So I'll answer your question somewhat indirectly, Alton, by saying that I'm very excited about differentiation, defensibility. Like these are like the most important things today. And I'll also, I'll also credit a little bit of like pedigree. So if you've been spending more time doing AI than crypto, and you find something that's like highly defensible and differentiated to bring to the crypto ecosystem, or use crypto economics or crypto primitives to substantiate building decentralized AI, those are like super valuable. So I don't think there is a specific call to action here about short term versus long term. I know this is, also you and I have known each other for a little while, where it is, for me, it's really about the people and bringing credible backgrounds into this world that actually matter to me the most. And it may be short term, it may be a band-aid today, but as long as it's symptomatically fixing something that's going to exist in the long haul, like, that's going to matter, more. So long way of saying that I don't have a short term lens. It's all a long term lens, and would love partnering with just great, smart people who have a very opinionated point of view and building something that's like very, very, very hard to do. And that makes for a differentiated product and go to market.
Man, I don't want to just wax philosophically. We'll make sure to cut that part. But my question for you, man, I always like to asking people this. So in your industry, your day-to-day, what is one area that you think more attention should be on, that you're like, I see it, but you don't think as many people see it in the AI, and it can be AI, crypto, either way?
Yeah, I know we touched on this briefly. I would say it's data. For me, it feels like it's it's the oil in some ways, right? Like it's necessary for functioning of large scale systems, and we're taking it for granted to some extent. It's going to continue to be a problem because I think Alton touched on this, right? Like these incumbent centralized systems have sort of run away with large models today. And so if I had to get, if I had to get up to par with where they are, it's hard because this has been, 30 years of data in the making with smart, sophisticated systems that have scraped the crap out of the internet and can have trained themselves exceptionally well. So data is something I think about a lot. So there's several offshoots of that: user contributed data, user provenance, like, hey, Jared's data, what does that mean? And then how do I like it from, again, there's the user POV, there's a developer point of view, which is like, I think like a terrible example again is that, like, I would love to run this is like hypothetically, impossible, but like not even hypothetically, it was like practically impossible. But if I run a model, I would love for it to, if I run an inference against a model, I would love for it to say, like, what are the different sort of data sources that contributed to this inference? It's kind of like saying, I want to run this dash dash debug, like in debug mode, where I want to kind of figure out, like, what is the source of this, what is the source of this inference? Like, why did you tell me what you just told me? Like, because it's not like you're just pointing me to a website. There was something that contributed to this intelligence, and I want to understand what that is, because that will and there's so much that needs to happen underneath for that to become the case. So long way of saying data is one thing, and then that's like here. It's like now, here and now. The prescient, maybe, and I'm not trying to sound egotistical or give myself too much credit by any means, but like in Zuck's interview with Dwarkesh, for example, the one thing that got teased out a lot was energy, the need for energy, and how we're just taking this for granted, right? Like centralized services are just like running away with this and like using, like, gigawatts and gigawatts of energy just to be able to train these models, like, because all these GPUs are running at full throttle to be able to do this kind of work. And that is just training. And then we have inference, which is a whole other, ball game. So that's another one that I think about. And I don't know where, like, there's probably an answer here somewhere about like where that meets sort of like blockchain infrastructure. But I feel like this is the beginning of like unlocking that piece, and so I'll just throw that grenade over and let someone maybe catch it or run away from it.
Awesome, man. Well, Alton, any other questions, or should we wrap it up? I mean,
I think we should. If I ask another one, it's gonna get.
Sorry
last
for being
thoughts,
so long-winded. Sorry for
no,
being
not
so
all,
long-winded.
man.
No,
It's
no, it's
super
a good
interesting.
idea. What are your last thoughts? I guess if somebody were to listen to this podcast, what they should take away about anything, about you, about chain abstraction, about AI, about your Twitter Twitter handle. Yeah.
That is an excellent question. I would say, well, just maybe two things. One, build for the future. Have a long enough time horizon, because I think things are going to change a lot in the next few years. But the coolest, smartest, greatest founders, and I'm guessing your demographic is a technical audience, maybe, some who are thinking about starting companies or trying to follow, footsteps, all time. But um, put yourself out into the future and think about what the world will need in the shortish term. And it could be, I don't know what the time frame is, 6 months, 2 years. Things are going to change a lot, because those people who kind of live in the future are have an exemplary view of what to build and how to get there. And the second piece is, um, many, and I think Mark Andreessen said this very well in a more succinct way than what I'm about to say, which is, yeah, the best founders tend to manifest their perception into reality. So it's your job to try to convince others, to some extent, like, don't make this a full-time job, but like, when you're able to evangelize and convince people that, like, look, I see a world in which there needs to be like a decentralized social network, something like, an analog to Twitter is what Farcaster's become, right? So, and Dan has been steadfast about that for the last couple of years. And so I think there are visionary founders like that who have a lens into the future and can turn turn perception into reality and evangelize that to others. And so if you're that archetype, obviously I would love to talk to you and learn about you. But also, kudos to you for being one step ahead and thinking about building something for our future. So that would be my ask and hopefully my takeaway.
That's great, man. Well, Altan, I mean, this is what a cool, like, interesting episode. But thanks so much for your time and sharing your thoughts and being so thoughtful. It's been really interesting.
Thank you so much. Thank you both.
If you get a chance to work with Anand, I recommend. It's but yeah, thanks for being with us. I hope we didn't. I hope we had fun. I mean, it was just a really fun episode to talk about something completely different, because we've been chatting about chain abstraction. This is more like chain abstraction AI, everything bundled into one. So that's right. Fun.
Definitely. All right, cool. Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks all.